Well, good evening. Thank you very much for coming out and having part in this conversation. Thank you very much, Professor Wright, for the invitation and for this introduction. It's really an honor for me to speak here at the Jewish Community Center and in the series and at the invitation of the Arizona Judaic Center. Talking about anti-Semitism, of course, is also here in Tucson. It's an honor for me to speak here at the place where one of the leading historians on anti-Semitism was very active. Leonard Dinnerstein, you probably know not only his name, but probably personally you know him. Unfortunately, I came too late to this town to meet him personally. As you know, probably he passed away almost 2 weeks ago. When Edward Wright sent me an invitation to come here last year, none of us would have thought that in 2018 would be the year of the worst anti-Semitic attack in the history of the United States. 11 Jews praying in the synagogue were shot for being Jewish in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on October 27 last year. We already had some signs of a rise of anti-Semitism in this country, such as the white supremacists marching in Charlottesville in summer 2017, shouting, "Jews will not replace us," and other anti-Semitic slogans. I still think that the situation is much different from France and other European countries, but anti-Semitism has shown its ugly face also in this country, and the threat seems to be growing, even if there are also some encouraging tendencies. However, the focus of my talk will be on Europe, and more specifically on France, Britain, and Germany, where more than 80% of European Jews live today. I will try to answer two simple questions. First, how threatened are Jews in Europe today? Or how do Jews in Europe see anti-Semitism? And secondly, who are the anti-Semites? Or what are different groups of anti-Semites coming from? However, certainly in this country, but in Europe too, there's also reason for hope. Not all is black and white. European countries today are relatively strong democracies that protect their citizens, including their Jewish citizens. We have been through a long period of peace, and no war within Europe seems to be lurking. This is a very different picture from the end of the 19th century or the 1920s and 30s. And what few people would have thought possible, in many places in Europe today we have vibrant Jewish communities, despite the fact, of course, that almost all of these communities were destroyed during the Second World War by the Nazis and their collaborators. Even in Berlin, for example, we have today 4 rabbinical seminaries. There are kosher restaurants and cafes, well, a handful altogether, but still. There are Jewish schools, including 3 Jewish elementary schools and 13 active synagogues. However, all these synagogues, Jewish schools, and community centers have to be protected around the clock. All synagogues are guarded 24/7. In Germany, this is nothing new. Jewish buildings have been protected by police for decades. The threats, including terror threats, have changed over the years. Whereas neo-Nazi groups have always been a concern, radical left terrorist cells have also attacked synagogues, supposedly in solidarity with Palestinians. But now the largest terror threat against Jewish communities comes from violent Islamists, so-called jihadists. Since early 2015, France has taken drastic security measures to protect its Jewish institutions. Synagogues, Jewish schools, community centers, and even kindergartens are protected by soldiers with machine guns. Some of you might remember the horrendous attack against a Jewish school 7 years ago in Toulouse, the city where my wife is from and where I lived for some years. In 2012, a jihadist came to the Oratora school in Toulouse and killed 3 small children and a father who was also a teacher there at the same school. This attack had a devastating effect on Jewish communities, not only in Toulouse and France, but well beyond. Because of its brutality, and also because of the fact that children in a Jewish school were targeted. And that meant that Jewish children were not safe anymore, even in Jewish schools, where some parents put their children to avoid anti-Semitic harassment that their children had experienced in public schools. This was one of the events that made many Jews wonder if their children still have a future in France. And some of my French Jewish friends have been looking at the housing market in Israel ever since. Unfortunately, there were a number of other murderous incidents where Jews were killed for being Jewish. 17 people have been murdered in the 21st century in Europe for being Jewish. Most of them in France, and all of them by jihadists or by people influenced by jihadist ideas. The most recent murder was in March last year. Mireille Knoll, an 85-year-old Holocaust survivor, was murdered in her own apartment in Paris. One of the 2 suspects was a neighbor who allegedly shouted "Wallahu Akbar" while killing her. You cannot have guards in front of every Jewish home, but certainly all Jewish community centers across Europe now need protection, which is, in itself is a very sad fact. In Britain, security measures are more discreet, but very effective thanks to the excellent cooperation between the Community Security Trust and police. Many attacks have been foiled. But such violent attacks, as shocking as they are only a small part of anti-Semitic incidents. Anti-Semitic incidents have risen sharply since the year 2000. In France, in the 1990s, there were about under 100 incidents per year, and since 2000, it has never fallen below 300. And in some years, it went up to almost 1,000 incidents per year. Violent acts have also increased in absolute numbers and percentage-wise. Anti-Semitic acts have become more violent in the last 2 decades. The numbers for the UK also show an increase, but more gradually. Last year, there was another record of anti-Semitic incidents, 1,650 incidents, 200 of which physical, that is, extreme violence, assaults, damages, and desecrations. Each one of these incidents spread a devastating message to the whole community. Jews are targeted for being Jewish, and it could happen to any member of the community. These official recorded figures, of course, reflect only a fraction of the problem. Surveys have shown that only about 25% of Jews who have become victims of an anti-Semitic incident have reported that to police or to any other organization. That means about 3/4 of all incidents go unreported. So to get a realistic picture, we would probably have to multiply these figures by at least 4. Surveys about anti-Semitic attitudes in the general population, such as the recent CNN survey, are also reassuring. They have been on a high level for decades. Depending on the country and how the questions are asked, about 25% of the people in Western Europe believe in a number of anti-Semitic stereotypes, mostly that Jews are rich and control the media, finances, and the government around the world. But whatever the anti-Semitic attitudes are, more and more people seem to translate that into action. It has been, or it is, no wonder that Jewish community leaders across Europe are increasingly alarmed about anti-Semitism. The former chief rabbi in the UK, Jonathan Sachs, for example, said in April last year, "There is today almost no European country where Jews feel safe." According to the Community Security Trust, anti-Semitic incidents in Britain have risen to their highest level since record keeping began in 1984. at an average of 4 a day. This is not the Britain I know and love. And in France, after the murder of Mireille Knoll, Francis Califat, who is the president of Groupe, the umbrella organization of French Jewish organizations, said that anti-Semitism in France has moved, I quote, from the streets directly into the homes of Jewish people. And by this he had the murderous anti-Semitism in mind that hit Mireille Knoll. In Germany, Dr. Josef Schuster, head of the Central Council of Jews, said, "It is part of everyday Jewish life, however, that our institutions are under police protection, Jewish pupils are under police protection, and we are increasingly reluctant to make ourselves known as Jews in public." Unfortunately, anti-Semitism has become part of everyday life experiences of many Jews in Europe. Many have personally experienced some forms of anti-Semitism. Surveys show for at least a third of Jews in the UK, in France, and in Germany, the countries where today most Jews in Europe live. According to a survey commissioned by the EU, conducted in 2018 in 12 European countries, 39% of the more than 16,000 Jewish participants in this survey had experienced some form of anti-Semitic harassment in the past 5 years. And 7% had personally experienced some form of violence or vandalism. And here are the numbers for Germany, France, and the UK. Other surveys in Germany and in France have confirmed these staggering numbers. And of course, this has an impact. Many Jews avoid being identified as Jewish, or even visiting Jewish community centers, as this one, or synagogues, because they are afraid of anti-Semitic attacks. 28% frequently or always avoid wearing symbols that would reveal their Jewish identity because they're afraid of anti-Semitic harassment. However, different Jewish communities experience that differently. You're more likely to become the target of anti-Semitic insults and violent attacks if you're visibly Jewish. That is certainly the case for Orthodox Jews, and if you're male, and if you're young. And it also depends on where you live. In some areas and in some social circles, you're not likely to experience anti-Semitism. It is therefore a mixed picture, and different people will tell you different things. Despite all the statistics and surveys, there are many Jews in France, in Germany, and in Britain who are happy to live there. Others have moved to countries, including Israel, to other countries, including Israel, and also to this country, but this is still a minority. My personal guess is that we will see some more people moving away from Europe, but we won't see an exodus of Jews from Europe simply because it's very difficult to move, and most British Jews feel very British. Most French Jews feel very French, and so on. Much of the movement, however, will be within countries or even within cities. We have seen such a development in Paris. However, let me come to my second question. Who are the main perpetrators? What kind of evidence do we have? Well, we have surveys among Jews on their perceptions of the perpetrators. And in some police statistics, we have some indications about the background of perpetrators. And of course, we have observations of the media and anecdotal evidence. In surveys among Jews on perceptions of perpetrators, we see that this depends on the country. However, Jews in Western Europe, where 80% of Jews in Europe live today, say that Muslim perpetrators are the biggest group of perpetrators. Then come perpetrators identified as leftists, more or less on the same level as right-wing groups. This came as a surprise to me, but this is what 4 different surveys found. In statistics and cooperation with police, we find only limited information about the background of perpetrators. In Britain, ethnic minorities are overrepresented, but the majority of perpetrators are white. In France, since the year 2000, perpetrators of what they call in statistic Arab Muslim background form the largest group of identified perpetrators, well before perpetrators who have been identified to be politically of the extreme right. In addition to anti-Semitic acts, there are also anti-Zionist acts that very often target Jews indirectly. We've seen this particularly in Britain, where it went from anti-Israel campaigns on campuses, in academic trade unions and trade unions in general, and now to the Labour Party. These organizations have been accused of institutional anti-Semitism and creating a hostile environment for Jews. Part of it is the permanent accusation and suspicion against Jews of being Zionist or pro-Israel, which of course many Jews are. Israel has been an important dimension of Jewish identity over hundreds, over thousands of years. I probably don't have to tell you. Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party in Britain, has become a symbol of this kind of anti-Israelism, anti-Zionism that is a threat to Jews, and it's a threat more to Jews in Britain than to Jews in Israel. Over the past months, we have seen unprecedented developments of Jewish community leaders in Britain speaking out bluntly against Corbyn and the Labour Party. This is not only very unusual for leaders of British Jewry. They are, of course, very British, so rather reserved and usually stay away from partisanship. Such alarming messages are completely unprecedented, and nobody would have thought so just a few years ago. Take, for example, the joint editorial of Britain's 3 leading Jewish newspapers, the Jewish Chronicle, Jewish News, and Jewish Telegraph, wrote a joint editorial, in July 2018. In itself, a highly unusual event that these newspapers publish a joint editorial. However, the editors say that they see, and I quote, existential threat to Jewish life in this country that would be posed by a Jeremy Corbyn-led government. Why are many British Jews so worried? Let's hear from the Board of Deputies of British Jews and the Jewish Leadership Council. They issued a statement in March 2018. I quote, Jeremy Corbyn did not invent this form of politics, but he has had a lifetime within it and now personifies its problems and dangers. When Jews complain about an obviously anti-Semitic mural in Tower Hamlets, Corbyn, of course, supports the artist. Hezbollah commits terrorist atrocities against Jews, but Corbyn calls them his friends and attends pro-Hezbollah rallies in London. Exactly the same goes for Hamas. Raed Salah says Jews kill Christian children to drink their blood. Corbyn opposes his extradition and invites him for tea at the House of Commons. These are not the only cases. He is repeatedly found alongside people with blatantly anti-Semitic views, but claims never to hear or read them. Again and again, Jeremy Corbyn has sided with anti-Semites rather than Jews. At best, this derives from the far left's obsessive hatred of Zionism, Zionists, and Israel. At worst, it suggests a conspiratorial worldview in which mainstream Jewish communities are believed to be a hostile entity, a class enemy. End of quote. This gives already some indication of the rationales, the reasoning of people who might consider themselves anti-Zionist, but in effect pose a danger to Jewish life. Summing up the main groups of anti-Semites, we have basically 3 extremist groups, that is the radical left anti-Zionist, the extreme right, and Islamists. So this is not particularly new. What is new that ideas from these fringes drift into mainstream and become more popular. And I want to use now the last part of my presentation to give you an overview of the rationals, of the reasoning of these three different groups and how they influence the mainstream. The ideological sources of political anti-Semitism are still on fringes. The extreme right, the anti-imperialist left, and political Islam all more or less openly aim for a revolution against liberal democracy. Despite the differences, they share anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism as part of their core ideology. These fringe groups do not necessarily get bigger, and we don't have to be afraid, I think, of an immediate coup d'etat, but fragments of these ideologies now drift from the fringes into the mainstream. If we look at ideas from the radical left, anti-Zionism and radical opposition to Israel is now a mainstream opinion in many circles. Israel is demonized and Jews are suspected of supporting this supposedly evil state. If you look at the influences of Islamists, they are not representative at all for Muslims in Europe, but they are the loudest voices among Muslims and they are well organized. I'm talking here about non-jihadist organizations that are close to the Muslim Brotherhood or similar Islamist organizations that are non-violent or at least not to the level of jihadists. If we look at the influence of the extreme right, they are also still marginal, but the populist far right has had a number of electoral successes. They have still links to the extreme right and give nationalists and white supremacists a home, many of whom exclude Jews as part of the nation. Let's talk more about these three groups. Let's start with the extreme right and the populist right. There are still violent neo-Nazis in Germany and in most countries east of Germany, even if they are only partly organized in political parties and not very successful in elections. And then we have the populist right with growing electoral successes in a number of countries. They are now in government in Austria, in Hungary, and in Poland. They often have links to more extreme groups or parties. Their agenda is nationalistic, anti-immigrant, and revisionist. The latter is one of their most important themes. They want to glorify or whitewash the past of the nation, particularly the part of the time of the Second World War and the Holocaust. In Hungary, the Fidesz party under Orban celebrates anti-Semites who cooperated with the Nazis, like Miklos Horthy. In Poland, the governing PiS party criminalizes any mentioning of Poles as, I quote from the text of the law, being responsible or complicit in the Nazi crimes committed by the Third German Reich, end of quote. The populist right in Germany, the AfD, is not in government, but had a huge success in the last general elections. A recurrent theme with this populist right party is the diminishing and trivialization of the Holocaust. One of its party leaders, Alexander Gauland, said in June last year, I quote, "Hitler and the Nazis are just a speck of bird shit in over 1,000 years of successful German history." So the populist right, the populist far right, trivializes the Holocaust. It also aims to restrict religious freedom of minorities, that is, circumcision and ritual slaughter. What's the reasoning or what are the rationales of the Islamists? Islamists, per definition, want to build a society that's not based on man-made laws, but on Sharia law. They believe in an eternal enmity and war between Muslims and Jews and Christians. They conflict in religious terms. That is, they see the territory of Israel as Muslim lands where Jews should not be in charge. So they are fundamentally opposed to a Jewish state. Antisemitism has been part and parcel of Islamism or political Islam since its beginning in the first half of the 20th century. This can be seen in writings, for example, of Muslim Brotherhood leaders such as Said Qutb, who wrote a pamphlet with the programmatic title, I quote, "Our Struggle with the Jews." Unfortunately, many European Muslim organizations, in fact, the majority, are now dominated or influenced by Islamist organizations such as the Muslim Brotherhood. As I said, Muslim organizations of political Islam are not representative for Muslims in Europe, even if they often pretend to be. However, they often control the local mosques and pay for the imams and Muslim education, and they organize many cultural events. It is therefore no surprise that educational material is often full of anti-Western and anti-Semitic stereotypes, and that extremist literature can be found in many Islamic bookshops in many mosques. Islamist organizations take advantage of the lack of secular Muslim organizations and of the lack of interest by non-Muslims, by mainstream politicians who have long supported what can be called parallel societies. I want to give you a personal example. One of my best friends was born in Cologne in the 1970s to Turkish immigrants. And they were living in a house a few blocks away from our house. But he got to a separate elementary school where everything was taught in Turkish, not in German. The aim was that Turkish immigrants and their children would leave Germany for Turkey one day soon and should not mix with the German population. Well, that didn't work out. We became friends, and he still is in Germany, successful lawyer, and I was the one who left eventually. In any case, anti-democratic attitudes, including Islamist attitudes, have rarely been challenged in migrant communities. On the contrary, non-violent Islamist organizations have received funding and political support by authorities in Germany, in France, and in Great Britain. Moderate Muslims are often left out and don't get much political support. The Muslim Brotherhood, by the way, is also influential in this country and has links to many American Muslim organizations. Some big ones, such as CARE, on American Islamic relations. In any case, and for a number of reasons, anti-Semitic attitudes are much Muslims than among non-Muslims in all European countries. All relevant surveys, and there are 18 that I know of, come to these same results. And anti-Semitic views can be found not only among extremist Islamists, but also among many moderate Muslims. Back to the anti-Zionists and their ideological sources. I'll give you a recent example of an anti-Zionist hate crime that is clearly anti-Semitic. French Member of Parliament, Mayor Habib, received a letter at the end of August 2018. The envelope had a note and white powder in it, leading a wing of the French National Assembly to be evacuated. The letter began, I quote, "Fat Zionist pig, you are not French. You do not belong in the assembly. You are only a fucking Israeli terrorist with blood on your hands." Well, in Europe, you pronounce the words as they are. I see that here you usually don't do so, but that's what was written in the letter. Such hate crimes are not a daily occurrence, but such letters are. So not with white powder usually, but such letters are. Jewish communities in Germany, for example, have received thousands of letters and emails with this kind of content. The anti-Zionist left accuses Jews of supporting the alleged evil nation state of Israel. This is part of an anti-imperialist worldview that accuses Israel and the United States of imperialism and colonialism. This goes back not only to the Soviet anti-Zionist campaigns from 1950s onward, in which Israel and Zionism was demonized with anti-Semitic tropes from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. The black and white framing of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict also goes back to teachings by Mao Zedong and Che Guevara. In a supposedly Marxist interpretation, they reinterpreted class conflict as conflicts between oppressed peoples and oppressor peoples. And part of this Manichaean, this black and white thinking has gone mainstream in the left, initially often in parts of the Third World solidarity movements. Conflicts are thought of primarily in terms of power structure, where one side is oppressed and the other is the oppressor. And of course this comes with the moral obligation to side unconditionally with people that are thought of as oppressed. In any case, for this, but also for more psychological reasons that have to do with a guilty national conscience of the Holocaust, or for the Holocaust, or for other crimes, Israel is not much liked in Europe, at least in Western Europe. Many people project their negative sentiments onto Israel. Between 35 and 40% in Germany, France, and Britain have negative views of Israel, and only about 16 to 19% have a positive view of Israel. This is very different in the United States. Here, according to recent polls, 3/4 of the population have a favorable view of Israel. The British Institute for Jewish Policy Research did a survey about attitudes towards Israel in Britain, and they found an interesting correlation. The stronger a person's anti-Israel views, the more likely they are to hold anti-Semitic attitudes. Among those holding a large number of anti-Israel attitudes, only 26% do not hold any anti-Semitic attitudes. 86% of those who do not hold any anti-Israeli attitudes also do not hold any anti-Semitic attitudes. So, at least in the British context, if you find somebody with an anti-Israel view, it's likely that this person also don't like Jews. And if you find somebody who is not obsessed negatively with Israel, you have likely found somebody who is also not an anti-Semite. There are, of course, many counterexamples, and you could spend another hour or so just listening about counterexamples, but these are the odds if you believe in statistics. So this and also other show that anti-Semitic attitudes and anti-Israel attitudes are not the same, but they're often closely correlated. To conclude, although the rationales are different, Israel and what they call in a derogatory way Zionists can serve parts of the radical left and Islamists as a common enemy, and we have seen some alliances already. This is helped by the widespread demonization of Israel that handily stands for all that is bad. First and foremost, in an era of human rights, Israel is portrayed as the human rights abuser par excellence and as a deeply racist country. The populist right, on the other hand, does not have Israel as an enemy. It is too much concerned with national homogeneity to really accept Jews as equal citizens. And anyway, the populist right has anti-democratic tendencies, a threat for any minority, frankly. Additionally, because of its link to the extreme right and its conspiratorial view of fake news, for example, it's full of anti-Semitic stereotypes, and conspiracy fantasies flourish in this movement. So what do you expect from the future? Well, much depends on those who do not or do speak up against anti-Semitism. Historically, the level of anti-Semitism, violence against Jews, has depended not so much on the anti-Semites, but on those who speak up and keep them in check. I'm moderately optimistic that we can find enough people in this country, but hopefully also in Europe, who realize that this is a threat to open and liberal societies. Anti-Semites or anti-Semitism doesn't end with the Jews. It doesn't even start with the Jews. It starts with dishonesty. And I think it's time to have a frank discussions about all these issues. Thank you very much.